There is no finer sight than that of the intelligence at grips with the reality that eludes it, that discipline that the mind imposes on itself, that will conjured up out of nothing, that face-to-face struggle have something exceptional about them. And here Camus is talking about the revolt, that response to the absurdity of your existence. So, in this video, this last segment on Camus for this week, we'll talk about that revolt. Quickly here, I want to just go again and say just a bit more about why he argues against putting your faith in a higher power to resolve this condition of yours, this distance between your need for explanation and meaning and purpose and what the universe offers you. That silence. So he says, as we covered last video, when you put your faith in a higher power, you're doing something that does not actually follow from the very elements of your condition. Right? It doesn't follow from this reasonable, rational call for meaning, for unifying yourself with the world, and the irrational, incoherent silence or even noise, as we spoke of last video, that all the world seems to give us. It rests on this hope that there's this third being, right? So you allow for another entity, another premise to come into the equation. You rest on this hope that this thing exists and that this thing would solve the riddle of your life. And you stake the meaning, the worth of this life. You say, okay, that God, that being has a meaning for me, and that God, by virtue of existing and having that meaning for me, provides worth to my life. That, I might in some way treat this life as a way as getting to an eternal life, right? A heaven of sorts. And that this life's worth is really only measured by that eternity, that heaven that I aim to live and exist in. So what happens here is you stake the meaning and the worth of life on a hope and not on what is certain about this life, this experience that you're living now, Camus says. And he says this is a form of philosophical suicide. If complete resignation, as we spoke of in the last video, meant physical suicide, here we have something like philosophical suicide, he says. Because what's happening here is we're seeking not what is true, right? We're seeking maybe what is desirable. So, and he points out, page 41, seeking what is true is not the same as seeking what is desirable. He says, I understand why the doctrines that explain everything to me, right? The doctrines that explain everything to me, the doctrines that hold out a promise to me that there are reasons, there are answers, that these debilitate me at the same time, because they relieve me of the weight of my own life, and yet I must carry that weight alone, he says. They relieve you of thinking through this yourself, of working through this self. They relieve you of that immense struggle of facing that silence that the universe has when you ask these questions. So you're kind of giving up your reason here. You're handing over the powers of your own mind, giving it to some being that you hope exists. This approach is hope of another life that one must deserve, or trickery of those who live not for this life itself, not for these experiences, but for some great idea that will transcend it, refine it, perfect it, right? Give it a meaning, but it betrays it, right? It betrays the very experiences you're having now, he says, because hope for another life, for a better life than this one, well, that renders this life that you're living as worth less, right? Worth less than that other life. That it is somehow not as valuable. So these are arguments for why faith in a higher power, he says, won't do for a human response to your own condition. So the revolt. How do we become the absurd hero of our own lives? Well, remember, he wants to deal with this on human terms, to find the worth of life and what is drawn from your experience of this life, to have no illusions, to engage with what you see, to demand of yourself with solely with what you know, to accommodate yourself to what you are, to bring nothing in that is not certain. In The Rebel, later on, he says, unless we choose to ignore reality, right? Ignore the actual situation we find ourselves in. Ignore the day-to-day. Ignore the daily interactions with the people we love, with the people we hate, right? All the things that make up our hours, our weeks, our years. If we ignore all that, right? Unless we ignore all that, we must find our values in it, right? That's where value is going to come from. That's where value will be found. So, the revolt. If we look at that word, revolt, and we look at the etymology of it, it really means to overturn. And that's what Camus is talking about. You keep your condition in place. I mean, the elements are there, but you're overturning your approach to your own condition. You're overturning your attitude toward your own condition. It's this inward shift from being carried away by the absurdity of your existence to carrying it yourself, to putting it on your back, carrying it forward. It is this revolt, the absurd response to your absurd existence, right? It is a way of responding that is absurd, as we will see. It is a way of responding that follows coherently from your condition. Remember, that coherence is what he's after, living coherently in an incoherent life. So this is the logic behind the revolt. It's absurd. It's an absurd response because you are, without any illusions, fully aware that you can never quite unify yourself with the world, that you can never quite find that meaning. But nevertheless, you pursue it. You pursue this impossibility. You pursue and you intensify that struggle through your actions, through your projects, through how you envision yourself, through how you shape what you want to do in this world. You pursue things as if it will give you meaning, even though you know it won't last. And it's coherent from the very premises of your conditions, or with the very premises of your conditions, in that you remain true to those conditions. This is derived from those terms. It doesn't deny one of them, like suicide, where it denies what you have within you that creates the condition you find yourself in, your call for meaning and understanding, doesn't deny that. And it doesn't bring in something else, this extra term, this extra entity, this extra being, God, to help you figure that out. This hope, this thing that you're not certain about. So the logic of revolt here that he is employing preserves the absurdity, right? The conclusion, the way we respond, it preserves that absurdity, preserves that coherency that he's after. We recall from one of the first videos that we looked at this week, or that you viewed. He says a life worth living, this is my summary of him, is a life, live without illusion, a life committed to exhausting the human condition, right? And so it's living without illusion. That means living with what you're certain of, reckoning only with what you know. And that condition of yours being absurd, so you are exhausting that absurdity. You are maximizing it. You are getting everything you can out of it. Out of that desperate encounter between your desperate attempts at finding meaning in the silence of the world. So we'll shrink this down, we'll move it up here, and we'll go back to Sisyphus here and kind of apply this to his story, right? So here's Sisyphus's hill, there's his boulder, and there he is. And Camus says we must imagine Sisyphus happy, right? And at the start of this we said, how is Sisyphus happy? How can we imagine him happy? You know? I mean, think about Sisyphus there becoming conscious of his own fate and saying, oh man, I gotta roll this rock up this hill and endlessly and watch it roll back down and go back and roll it up. You know, if he gives up, resigns himself, takes himself out, that's it, right? Camus has given us arguments for why he ought not to do that. But then maybe he says, you know what, I don't know what I'm doing here, I don't know why I'm doing this, but the gods, they have an explanation, they have a reason, they have a meaning for all this. And so I guess I'll just roll this rock up this hill and hope that the gods have some answer for why I'm doing this. Well, Camus gives us reasons for not going that route either. But the revolt for Sisyphus would be something like this. Sisyphus would become fully aware, clear about what his fate entails. Clear that he has to do this endlessly, right? No illusions about it. No illusions that it comes to nothing. That he's not going to be, building anything with pushing this boulder up this hill over and over again. And yet, what he does is he has that overturning within himself, that shift, that inner shift, where he grasps his condition. He takes firm hold of his situation. And he carries it as if he's carrying that rock, right? As if he's pushing that rock. He pushes his own fate, his own life. He takes command of it. So he has the certainty of that fate, of a crushing fate. But he doesn't resign himself to it. He doesn't give up. He doesn't surrender to it. He draws on the experience itself to get all of the quality out of it. So he says, you know what? I'm going to roll this rock up this hill countless times, and I'm going to throw myself into this activity all the more. I am going to embrace this. I am going to take stock of everything that is involved in this activity and try to exhaust that. All the strength that it demands of me, every kind of way in which I might grip and hold that thing, the texture, the view, the actual tension, the momentary glimpses of the heights that I reach, will walk back down, the rest and the breath that I have, and then I do it again. All of that I'm going to appreciate, I'm going to love, I'm going to be happy with. And I'm going to keep doing this over and over and over again. I'm going to find what I can find of value in this experience that I know and that I'm certain of. So he does that, right? And Camus says the absurd is Sisyphus' extreme tension. He maintains this daily. He continues to reach for these goals of rolling that rock up that hill, attaining some goal, some height, even though he knows it won't last. But in doing this, Camus says, he proves his only truth. He proves his defiance. He does this out of defiance. He says, I don't care. I don't care if it comes to nothing. I'm going to do it all the more. I'm going to throw myself into it even more fully, even more intensely. It's this defiance that Camus talks about, that you, with the strength of everything that is human in you, you carry that rock that is your fate. You refuse, this is the defiance, you refuse to be carried away by it, right? To let it beat you. That would be suicide. You refuse to avoid carrying it, to give it to some other being, God, which you hope exists. That would be philosophical suicide for Camus, this hope. So, he says, Sisyphus must be happy. Sisyphus must embrace his fate. This is what gives value to his life. You say yes to your fate, as Nietzsche says a century earlier. That discipline that the mind imposes on itself, that will conjured up out of nothing, that face-to-face struggle, have something exceptional about them. To impoverish that reality whose inhumanity constitutes man's majesty is tantamount to impoverishing him himself, right? If we were to say that this was easy, that the answers were there, the reasons are clear, all we have to do is follow, all we have to do is listen, and we will understand and we will find meaning. And that meaning is in some other world, some other life, not this one. Well, then we impoverish this life, Camus is saying, if we were to go with that understanding of things. But when we live in revolt, we draw on our own inner strength, and it's this inner strength spread out over the length of our life that restores the majesty, he says, to our life. The strength it takes to live through this struggle, to not run from it and not be beaten by it. Now, later on, Camus, so this is all happening in the myth of Sisyphus, and later on in The Rebel, Camus will develop this view, because in the myth of Sisyphus, you have a solitary effort, right? As I point out here, that this is an individual kind of battle. But in The Rebel, Camus turns to the collective, and turns to his fellow man and says, you're in this fight as well. We're all kind of pushing these boulders up this hill, right? So there's a certain sense of solidarity that Camus builds in his later work, The Rebel. In that work, he says, the first progressive step for a mind overwhelmed by the strangeness of things is to realize that this feeling of strangeness is shared with all men, and that human reality, in its entirety, suffers from the distance which separates it from the rest of the universe. The malady experienced by a single man becomes a mass plague. It's fitting, right, for now. I mean, as I mentioned in, I think, the first video, Camus wrote a novel called The Plague, which I'm about to start myself. And that plague serves as a symbol in that novel. A symbol for this fight, this battle that you're up against in life. And here, today, presently, that plague is quite the reality for us, isn't it? He says, man's solidarity is founded on a rebellion. Right? So, I'd like to end this video here with a series of images of an artist, Alberto Giacometti, because I think Giacometti really exemplifies some of what Camus is after here, which is a man grappling with his own condition and rendering that condition with his own hands, through his own art, sculpting and painting, over and over again, each day toiling away in his studio, trying to get at the core of what a human being is, trying to give shape to human life, human existence, trying to give us some form and unify us in a way that we can understand ourselves better. This is Giacometti's project through his art. So I'll close out with just some images and a few quotes from Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. Those are the quotes that you'll see as we go through here.